The tiny, flickering candle sitting in the center of the table had dwindled down to a sad, pooling puddle of wax, its flame gasping for its final breath of air. When the cold truth finally settled into my chest, my blind date was not coming. She was never going to show up. All around me, the restaurant hummed with vibrant, mocking life. Couples leaned across candlelit tables, sharing soft laughter and stolen glances. Large families clinked glasses, celebrating birthdays with joyous clamor. And nearby, complete strangers engaged in effortless conversations that seemed to cast a warm, golden glow over everything, except for the deep, suffocating silence sitting directly across from me. I had checked my phone so many times that the cold, glass screen began to feel heavier than my own aching heart. Each dark reflection of my face, a quiet reminder of my own foolishness. I was only seconds away from throwing down some cash, paying the bill, and walking out into the cold night with yet another painful scar. Another reminder that in this life, holding on to hope can be an incredibly expensive investment. But just as I braced myself to stand, the waitress quietly slipped over. With a gentle, comforting grace, she slid a fresh, steaming cup of coffee in front of me. Then, without a word, she pulled out the empty chair, the one that had mocked me all afternoon, and sat down. There was an arresting quality in her eyes. It wasn't the pity that makes you want to shrink away, nor was it simple curiosity. It was the solemn, steady weight of someone holding onto a profound secret. She looked directly into my eyes, her voice barely above a whisper, and told me there was something she desperately needed to share with me. In that fleeting, breathless second, the entire trajectory of my evening, and everything I believed about my abandonment, was about to shift on its axis forever. Before we venture further into this deeply moving and unforgettable journey of two souls, please take a brief moment to like this video, leave a comment letting us know where in the world you are watching from, share this story with someone in your life who still holds on to a belief in human kindness, and subscribe to Tales of Kindness if you believe, deep in your heart, that second chances have a way of appearing precisely when we least expect them. Your quiet support is the wind beneath our wings, helping beautiful stories like this find their way to weary hearts all across the globe. My name is Rowan Mercer, and for the better part of my adult life, disappointment had ceased to be an occasional visitor. It had become my most faithful, familiar companion. I wouldn't go so far as to say I was cursed, or that life had been relentlessly cruel to me at every single turn. Rather, I was simply a man who had gradually learned the art of expecting very little from the world, having survival trained myself after years of fractured promises and sudden departures. The foundations had cracked early. My parents had gone through a bitter, exhausting divorce when I was still just a boy. Years later, my own engagement shattered into pieces a mere 2 months before I was supposed to stand at the altar and promise forever. And after those wounds partially closed, I poured years of my life into being the sole caretaker for my aging, fragile grandmother, holding her hand until her very last breath left her quiet room. When she passed, I looked in the mirror and realized that in caring for everyone else, I had completely forgotten how to construct a life or a heart for myself. My friends, tired of seeing me exist in the shadows, insisted that it was time to step back into the light and try dating again. After months of stubborn resistance, I finally yielded, agreeing to let one of them arrange a blind date. They swore up and down that she was different, that she was gentle, deeply thoughtful, and a person who intimately understood the heavy, quiet ache of loneliness. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I found myself caring about my reflection. I spent extra care selecting a crisp, clean blue shirt, trimmed my beard with steady hands, and arrived well ahead of schedule at a picturesque little daytime café. The venue overlooked a peaceful city park, which was alive with the vibrant colors of blooming summer flowers and the carefree laughter of children chasing pigeons under a brilliant, warm afternoon sun. The cafe itself was a sanctuary of simple, welcoming beauty. Thick, honeyed sunlight poured through the expansive glass windows, painting soft, glowing golden squares across the dark wooden floorboards. Vases of fresh-cut flowers adorned every single table, filling the air with a sweet, subtle fragrance, while the delicate, cascading notes of a solo piano floated gently through the room like a comforting embrace. I ordered a black coffee and waited. 10 minutes slowly bled into 20. 20 dragged heavily into 45. Every single time the front door chimed and swung open, my heart would leap into my throat, desperately preparing itself to smile, only to plummet back down into the cold depths of disappointment when the newcomer proved to be someone else. My polite messages sat on her screen, unread and ignored. My calls went straight to an empty dial tone. Eventually, the bitter numbness of embarrassment took over, and I convinced myself of the worst. Perhaps she had caught a glimpse of me and changed her mind, or perhaps someone had played a cruel, thoughtless joke on me, never realizing just how much raw courage it had taken for me to show up and sit there in the first place. Yet, through it all, the waitress had been quietly watching. Throughout that long, agonizing afternoon, she never once intruded on my solitude, never asked the uncomfortable questions that would have forced me to voice my humiliation, and never made me feel like an object of pity. Instead, she simply glided by to refill my coffee cup, refusing to charge me for a single drop, and occasionally offered a soft, reassuring smile that acted as a quiet anchor in the storm. When she finally took the seat opposite me, I braced myself, expecting her to politely ask me to free up the table for paying customers. Instead, she let out a slow, stabilizing breath and confessed that she knew the exact reason why my date had never shown up. She began to paint a picture of what had happened earlier that morning. A young woman had entered the cafe, holding a small, neat envelope tight against her chest. She had looked incredibly fragile and nervous, her eyes darting anxiously toward the entrance, before she approached the counter. With a trembling voice, she had begged the waitress to do her a favor, to hand this envelope to the man in the blue shirt, but only if he remained waiting at his table for at least an hour. The waitress, recognizing the quiet desperation in the girl's plea, had respected her wishes. She had waited until the clock ticked past the hour mark, and now, with gentle hands, she placed the envelope into my palms. Inside was a letter, written in a delicate, slightly shaky script. The writer introduced herself as Marin Holloway. She poured her heart out onto the paper, admitting that she had indeed come to the cafe with every intention of meeting me. She had even stood outside, hidden in the shadows of the street, watching me through the window for several long, agonizing minutes. But just as she reached for the door handle, an overwhelming, paralyzing wave of terror had gripped her. Years ago, Marin had survived a horrific car accident, an ordeal that had left deep, highly visible scars etched permanently across one side of her face. Since that fateful day, her life had been defined by a gauntlet of judgmental glances, heavy, uncomfortable stares from strangers, and the painful sting of people quickly looking away, pretending they hadn't noticed her disfigurement. She wrote that she was no longer afraid of outright rejection. She had grown numb to that. What she truly feared, with a terror that shook her to her core, was seeing the genuine warmth and kindness instantly vanish from a good man's eyes the very second he looked upon her scarred face. She closed her letter with a heartbreaking apology for her lack of bravery, hoping that someday I might find it in my heart to forgive a frightened stranger whose courage had crumbled at the final step. By the time I reached the final line, silent, heavy tears had welled up in my eyes, blurring the ink. The waitress, her own voice thick with emotion, gently confessed that there was one more detail. As Marin had turned to walk away from the cafe in defeat, She had dropped something on the pavement without realizing it. The waitress reached into her pocket and produced a delicate silver bracelet, engraved with 5 simple, profound words, "Still worth loving." Without a single second of hesitation, my instincts took over. I stood up so fast my chair scraped loudly against the floor and asked which way she had gone. The waitress pointed urgently toward the sprawling green park across the street. I sprinted out of the café, bursting beneath the wide, sun-drenched sky, pushing past children flying brilliant, multicolored kites and elderly couples tossing breadcrumbs to the birds beside the splashing fountain. Every face in the crowd became a desperate possibility, my eyes scanning frantically until, near a secluded garden path lined with fragrant, blooming red roses, I spotted her. She was sitting entirely alone on a weathered wooden bench, her shoulders trembling as she wiped tears from her cheeks, staring blankly out at the quiet, shimmering lake. She looked exactly as her letter had made me picture her. The physical scars on her face were clear and undeniable, but to me, they faded into absolute insignificance the moment I looked into her eyes and saw the sheer, devastating depth of her sorrow. I approached her slowly, trying not to startle her, and quietly extended my hand, holding the silver bracelet. She gasped, looking up in sheer shock before her face flushed crimson, and she lowered her head in deep embarrassment. For what felt like an eternity, neither of us moved or spoke. The world around us seemed to stand completely still. Then, a slow, genuine smile spread across my face. It was a smile born not of pity, but of a profound, sudden realization. In that quiet moment, I understood that we were mirror images of one another. We had both spent years of our lives wandering in the dark, believing that our cracked, broken pieces made us entirely impossible for anyone to love. Instead of demanding to know why she had run away or making her explain her fear, I simply looked at her and said, "Thank you for writing that letter." I told her it was the most beautiful, breathtakingly honest introduction anyone had ever given me. With those few words, the thick, defensive walls she had spent a lonely lifetime constructing began to visibly crumble. She looked up, her eyes wide, and quietly confessed that she had walked up to the cafe door 5 separate times that morning, only for the ghosts of her past to whisper that she wasn't enough, pulling her back every single time. Every cruel comment, every look of disgust she had ever received from her past echoed louder in her head than the fragile voice of hope. We spent the rest of that beautiful afternoon walking side by side through the winding paths of the park, opening up doors to our souls we never thought we would unlock for a stranger. I told her about the quiet, heavy years of nursing my grandmother, and the crushing blow to my self-worth when my engagement fell apart. In turn, she spoke of the terrifying metal-on-metal crunch of the accident, and how surviving it had not only altered the landscape of her face, but had completely shattered the way she viewed her own worth. Beneath those physical scars sat a woman who still desperately dared to dream of simple, ordinary happiness, yet had convinced herself that such beautiful things were reserved only for others. Weeks seamlessly dissolved into months. Our very first official, proper date took place at that exact same sunlit cafe on another beautiful afternoon. The waitress greeted us at the door with the warmest, most radiant smile either of us had ever seen, ushering us to our table like old friends. We sat together and laughed deeply about the incredibly messy, chaotic beginning that had almost prevented us from ever having a beginning at all. Gradually, we stopped trying to hide our scars, both my invisible emotional ones and her physical ones, and began using those very cracks to build a strong, resilient foundation for our shared future. Neither of us required perfection, flawless faces, or unblemished histories. We simply needed a partner who was willing to stay, to hold on tight, when life became uncomfortable and raw. The most beautiful surprise of all came nearly a year later, when we walked back into that familiar café, this time carrying a stack of elegant wedding invitations for the staff who had witnessed our beginning. The kind waitress, who had bravely chosen active compassion over comfortable silence on that fateful afternoon, was given a place of honor as one of our most cherished wedding guests. With tears in her eyes, she confessed to us that she had initially hesitated to hand me the envelope, worrying that she was overstepping her boundaries by getting involved in a stranger's business. But she chose to care anyway, and because of that one tiny, brave act of empathy, two deeply wounded, drifting hearts that had nearly passed each other by in the night were bound together forever. If this story of unexpected grace has touched something deep within your soul, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone in your life who might currently be navigating their own dark valley and losing hope, and subscribe to Tales of Kindness for more deeply moving, unforgettable stories that serve as a gentle reminder that true goodness and miracles still exist in this weary world. And as a very special request from our hearts to yours, please leave a comment below with the words, "Kindness always finds a way," if you believe with all your heart that a single, simple act of human compassion can completely rewrite the course of a person's life. As Marin and I walked out of the cafe hand in hand that sunny afternoon, I paused to look back through the window at that empty, quiet corner table where I had once sat engulfed in the bitter belief that I had been rejected and abandoned. In that beautiful moment of clarity, the truth washed over me. I had never actually been waiting for a woman who failed to show up. I had been waiting for life to gently shake me awake, to remind me that the most breathtaking love stories do not begin with flawless timing or cinematic perfection. They are born from ordinary kindness, from the unexpected, trembling courage of fragile souls, and from one person brave enough to speak the words that change the world. Sometimes, destiny doesn't knock politely on the front door right on schedule. Sometimes, it quietly pulls out the empty chair across from you, smiles with a heart full of understanding, and softly whispers, "Can I tell you something?" And from that breathtaking moment onward, every single day of your life becomes the beautiful, living answer.